Craig Dunmore called him a vagrant, which was the word he used in front of 63 people on the floor of Meridian Steel's Hamilton fabrication plant on a gray Tuesday in November. The man he said it to was standing near the secondary entrance in a canvas field jacket that had seen better years, holding a paper coffee cup from a Tim Hortons 2 blocks east, and he did not raise his voice or step back or do anything at all, except hold Craig's gaze with a patience that probably should have been a warning. Nobody on that floor said a word. What Craig Dunmore did not know was that the man he had just ordered off the premises had finalized the acquisition papers for this building 11 days earlier, and had driven 4 hours from Toronto that morning in a rental hatchback, specifically because he needed to understand who Craig Dunmore actually was. His name was Neil Forsythe, and at 53 he had the kind of face that made people underestimate him on sight, which was a quality he had long since stopped trying to fix. He was wide through the shoulders but not tall, with a gray beard he kept roughly trimmed and hands that had done real work before the boardroom years. He had been a widower for 6 years, long enough that the word had settled into something he simply carried rather than announced. His wife, Joanne, had died in the spring of a year that had already been difficult, and the grief had made him quiet in a way that had not left him. He did not fill silences. He let them breathe, and he had found over 2 decades of running companies that a man who can sit in a silence long enough will eventually be told everything he needs to know. The file on Craig Dunmore had reached Neil's desk 3 weeks into his tenure at Meridian Industrial, which had absorbed Meridian Steel as part of a broader restructuring that nobody in Hamilton had wanted, but most people had reluctantly accepted as the alternative to closure. The file was not dramatic. It was methodical, which was worse. 14 years of incident reports, grievance filings, 2 formal harassment complaints that had gone nowhere, a safety audit from 2021 that flagged 16 items with a notation that 9 of them remained outstanding 2 years later. A labor relations consultant had attached a single handwritten observation to the cover page. Management cultures this entrenched don't change through memos. Neil had read that line twice and then booked the rental car himself. His deputy director, a sharp woman named Andrea Kubek, who had been with him at 2 previous companies, had objected to the trip the way competent deputies object to things they know they cannot stop, thoroughly on the record and without any real expectation of success. She had argued that a newly appointed group CEO did not walk into an acquired plant unannounced, that the union rep would hear about it before he reached the parking lot, that if anything went sideways, the optics would be unmanageable. Neil had listened to all of it in the glass-walled boardroom on the 41st floor, and then said that reports written about people who have never been managed by someone like Craig Dunmore tend to read very calmly. Andrea had not had an answer for that, so they had agreed on 2 conditions. Neil would check in by phone every hour, and Andrea would have a team on standby 2 hours out. He left Toronto before 6 and pulled into Hamilton a little after 10, which was late enough that the morning shift was already deep into its rhythm. He had driven past the plant twice on purpose, the way a person does when he is not sure yet what he is looking at. The building was not beautiful. It was the industrial kind of functional that Hamilton had been producing for a century, brick and corrugated steel, a parking lot with a chain-link fence along the back that had a gap in it near the secondary entrance marked on no official diagram but used by workers every morning. He knew about the gap because it appeared in the 2021 safety audit and had been flagged twice since. He parked on the street, bought his coffee, and walked in through the secondary entrance the way those workers did. The floor was large and loud in the particular way fabrication floors are, metal on metal, the hydraulic sigh of presses, a radio playing something country over the noise. He stood near the entrance for perhaps 8 minutes, watching. The work was competent. The workers were competent. What he was looking at was not a facility with a skills problem. He was looking at a facility with a morale problem, and morale, in his experience, had a single address. He was watching a foreman named Patrice Hebert walk 2 younger workers through a welding setup near the east wall when Craig came through the supervisor's door. Craig was 46, a big man, broad across the chest, with the settled authority of someone who has not been questioned in a long time. He moved across the floor the way people move when they believe they own the room, and several workers near him made small adjustments without seeming to notice they were doing it. A step back, a turned shoulder, a sudden return to tasks that had not lapsed. Neil had seen that kind of movement before. It was not the movement of people who respected their manager. It was the movement of people who had learned to predict him. Craig stopped when he saw the stranger by the secondary entrance. He crossed the floor without hurrying and came close enough that his lanyard swung at eye level. He looked Neil up and down in one pass and did not extend a hand. He said there was no public access through that entrance, that if the man was looking for the administrative office, it was on the other side of the building, and that he would need to show ID and sign in before going anywhere else. Neil said good morning and told him his name. Craig said that was fine, that he still needed to go through admin. Neil said he hadn't finished his coffee yet, and that he'd been watching the welding operation near the east wall, and had a few questions about the setup if Craig had a minute. What happened next was the thing that 63 people on that floor would remember later, almost word for word. Craig looked at him for a moment, then looked at the floor around them, then looked back. He said, loudly enough that it carried past 3 workstations, that he had been running this facility for 14 years, that he knew every person who had authorization to be on that floor, and that the man in front of him was not one of them. He used the word vagrant. He said it clearly, and he said it once, and he let it sit in the air between them the way a man lets something sit when he expects it to do work. He said that if the gentleman did not move toward the exit in the next 30 seconds, he would have security move him. The radio seemed louder. Neil looked at him and did not move. He said evenly and without heat that his name was Neil Forsythe, that his wallet was in the left pocket of his jacket, and that he was happy to show identification. He said it at a normal volume, which meant that everyone within 12 feet heard every word clearly. Several of them would repeat it later, with the exact same phrasing. Craig said he would give him one more chance to walk out on his own. Neil said that seemed like an unusual offer to make to someone who had offered to produce ID. The silence that followed was the kind that costs a room something. Patrice Hebert had gone very still with his back half-turned and his eyes on the work in front of him, the way a person goes still when they are listening to something they do not want to be seen hearing. A woman at the quality inspection table, her name tag read Sheila, had put down her clipboard and was looking at her hands. At the far end of the floor, a worker named Barry Wicks had stopped what he was doing altogether and was watching the secondary entrance with his arms at his sides. Craig called for the security officer at the front door, a young man named Tyler, who arrived quickly and stood near the exit with his hands at his sides and looked at the floor. Craig said he was detaining a trespasser. Neil did not resist. He walked toward the exit with Tyler beside him and said nothing until they were through the secondary door and standing in the gray November air of the parking lot. Then he set his coffee cup down on the concrete curb, took his phone from his jacket pocket and made a call. The call lasted 40 seconds. Then he put the phone back and stood with his hands at his sides and waited. Inside, Craig went back through the supervisor's door. The floor resumed its noise slowly, the way it does when something has happened that people need a moment to process. Patrice picked up his clipboard and said something quiet to one of the young welders that nobody else could hear. At the quality inspection table, Sheila picked her clipboard back up and did not look at the form on it. Barry Wicks turned back to the line and kept his eyes there. Every one of them knew what had just happened. Every one of them had run the same arithmetic and arrived at the same answer, which was that a stranger's bad morning was cheaper than 14 years of consequences. Neil stood in the parking lot for 22 minutes. His phone rang at the 11-minute mark. Andrea, on schedule. He answered, gave his location in 2 sentences, said he was fine, and ended the call. It rang again at 19 minutes, which was off schedule. Off schedule meant she had already moved the team. At 10:38, 2 vehicles turned into the main lot from Barton Street, a gray fleet sedan and a white SUV with the Meridian Industrial corporate plate, the one with the downtown Toronto prefix that no Hamilton plant worker would know by sight. 4 people got out. Andrea came first in a dark coat, a folder under her arm. Behind her were 2 HR directors and the company's general counsel, a tall man named Douglas Pickett, who wore his lanyard on the outside of his coat because he had found over the years that it saved time. Andrea did not look at the building or the lot. She scanned and found Neil in 4 seconds. She said his name, not his title, just his name. He said he was fine. She said she knew that. Then she looked at the secondary entrance and back at him, and she said the thing she had clearly been holding since the 19-minute call. She said he could have ended this before he walked through the door. She said she had already pulled the exterior security footage, and the timestamp showed he'd stood in the lot for 6 minutes before he went in. Enough time to send the authorization email that had been sitting in draft on his phone since Sunday. Neil picked up his coffee from the curb, found it cold, and set it back down. He said that when the file on this facility had landed on his desk, it came with 14 years of incident reports and 2 harassment complaints that went nowhere and a safety audit with 9 outstanding items. He said he had read all of it in a building in Toronto where everyone in the room agreed the situation was serious, and nobody present had ever stood on that floor. He said he needed to understand what it actually felt like to be a person that building had decided wasn't worth the trouble. Andrea said that as of right now he had a team standing in a parking lot in November. Neil said Barry Wicks didn't. He said that Barry Wicks had filed a formal grievance in 2020 about a safety issue on line 3, and that 6 months later Barry Wicks was on a different shift with fewer hours, and that in 14 years nobody from the corporate office had ever come to Hamilton to stand beside him. He said the acquisition didn't change that fact unless somebody decided it should. He said the only way to know what needed changing was to experience what he was asking other people to simply accept as the cost of keeping their job. Douglas Pickett was already on his phone. Andrea opened the folder. They went through the secondary entrance together. Craig was back on the floor when they came in. He saw the lanyard first, then the folder, then the woman in the dark coat, then the general counsel, and then Neil walking behind them in the same canvas jacket, still without a badge, still holding nothing. The color left Craig's face in stages that were visible from the welding station, and Patrice, who was watching from across the floor, looked down at his clipboard and did not look back up for a long time. Douglas introduced himself by name and company and handed Craig a document that Craig did not read because he was looking at Neil. Neil said his name again, the same way he had said it the first time, no emphasis, no ceremony. He said that he was the CEO of Meridian Industrial, which had owned this facility for 11 days. He said he had offered to show identification twice that morning, and that the offer had not been accepted either time. Craig said that was not possible. Neil said it was. Craig said there had been no notification, that there were protocols, that if the man had come through the front entrance and introduced himself properly, as anyone in his position should. Neil said that he had walked in through an entrance that 63 employees used every morning, that he had offered his name and offered his identification, and that the response had been the word vagrant, spoken in front of the entire floor. He said he was not raising his voice. He was not. He said everything at the same consistent and unremarkable volume he had used all morning, which somehow carried further than anything Craig had said at any point. The floor was entirely quiet. Andrea set 3 sheets of paper on the supervisor's station beside Craig's hand. Pending safety audit compliance review. Formal documentation hold on all personnel files dated after the acquisition. Operational review effective immediately, conducted jointly with HR and an external labor consultant, beginning that afternoon. Craig looked at the papers and did not touch them. Neil said one more thing before he walked toward the supervisor's office. He said he had read the 14-year file, and that a man who had spent 14 years building a reputation could spend the next 40 minutes deciding what he wanted to do with it, because the records were going to show what they showed, regardless of what he decided. Then he walked away. It came apart the way things come apart when the documents have been sitting in a drawer the entire time. The safety audit items were documented item by item. The grievance files were pulled and cross-referenced. Barry Wicks, who was on the floor that morning only because he had switched shifts with a colleague, was approached quietly by one of the HR directors and asked if he was willing to speak. He looked at his hands for a long time and then said yes. After Barry, Sheila said she had something to say. After Sheila, a man from the second shift who had come in early to cover a vacancy said he had been waiting 2 years for someone from the company to ask. By the time the afternoon shift began, there were 11 people in the room they had set up in the plant manager's office, and 3 more waiting in the hallway. Craig Dunmore was placed on administrative suspension at 2:15 in the afternoon. He walked out through the main entrance alone. He did not stop at the supervisor's station to collect anything. Tyler, the young security officer who had stood at the secondary entrance with his eyes on the floor that morning, had been the only person in that building to say anything in the moment, not loudly, and not in time to change what happened. But at 10:20, he had gone to Sheila at the inspection table and said quietly that he did not think what had just happened was right. Sheila had called the plant's HR line 7 minutes before Andrea's vehicles turned onto Barton Street. The call had not reached anyone quickly enough to alter the morning, but it had been made, and the timestamp was in the log, and Douglas wrote it into the record by name. Neil did not leave Hamilton that day. He stayed 2 nights at a plain hotel off Main Street and spent most of both evenings reading through the files in the room. On the second morning, Andrea came with coffee and told him the Labor Relations Board had confirmed receipt of the compliance documents, that the union rep had requested a meeting for Friday, and that contractors had been assigned to the 9 outstanding safety items from the 2021 audit. That afternoon, he walked back to the plant, through the front entrance this time, with his ID badge clipped to his jacket. He went to the floor and found Patrice at the east wall near the welding setup. Patrice looked at him for a moment, then said, in French first and then English, that he had been about to say something that morning when Craig was talking, and that he had not said it, and that he had thought about that for 2 days straight. Neil said he understood. Patrice said he didn't think Neil understood entirely, because the thing about working somewhere for 11 years was that you stopped being able to see the arithmetic anymore. You stopped being able to tell whether you were choosing silence or just breathing. Neil said he thought that was exactly right. He said that was the reason he had come through the secondary entrance. He stayed on the floor for an hour. He asked the kind of questions that showed he had read the audit carefully, and he listened to the answers without interrupting. When the shift ended, a few workers nodded at him on the way out. Barry Wicks paused at the door and said, without looking directly at him, that he appreciated somebody finally coming. Neil said he should have come sooner, and he meant it without qualification. Craig Dunmore's suspension became a termination 11 days after he walked out without his coat. He called the corporate office twice during the first week. Neither call was returned by Neil, because Neil was a witness in the internal review and intended to stay one. The word vagrant appeared in the final report 3 times, each instance a direct quotation from the security footage, each followed by a notation that the subject had offered identification twice and that both offers had been refused. The reforms that followed were neither dramatic nor fast: new safety compliance timelines, a revised grievance process with mandatory response windows, body cameras for security staff on all access points, a standing labor management committee with 3 elected workers on it. Barry Wicks was appointed to the Health and Safety Subcommittee, which nobody in the plant found surprising, and most people quietly found appropriate. None of it was invented. All of it had existed in Meridian Industrial's own standards manual. It had simply never been enforced in this building by anyone who could not be ignored. What actually changed in Hamilton was smaller than any of that and harder to write into a policy document. People started talking. The HR room at the plant ran for 9 days. By the end, there were 44 statements on record, and 31 of them described incidents more than 2 years old, which meant that for 2 years the people in that building had each been carrying the same story, and each had believed they were the only ones still holding it. Neil Forsythe went back to the Hamilton plant on a Friday morning, 6 weeks after the Tuesday in November. He went at the start of the morning shift, in the same canvas jacket, in the same rental hatchback with the scratch along the rear panel. He parked on the street and bought coffee at the same Tim Hortons 2 blocks east. He walked toward the secondary entrance out of habit, then remembered the gap had been repaired. The entrance had a working keypad now and a camera above it with a green indicator light that was new. He went in through the front. When he came through the door onto the floor, the room did not stop the way it had on that first morning. It slowed. Heads came up along the line, one by one, and he was recognized before he had gone 10 steps. Patrice was at the east wall. He looked across the floor and said nothing. Then he set down his clipboard, stood straight, and nodded once. Beside him, the young welder he'd been teaching that first morning did the same. Then Sheila, from quality inspection. Then Barry Wicks, halfway down the line, who pulled his hands out of his work gloves and held them at his sides and stood. It moved through the floor in ones and twos until nobody in the building was sitting down. Not one of them said his title. Nobody said CEO. Nobody said anything at all. They stood the way people stand when they cannot find words for what they want to say, and standing is the only thing left that means something. And Neil understood exactly what it was, because it was not for the office he held, or the papers he had signed, or the team that had turned on to Barton Street in November. It was for 22 minutes in a parking lot in the cold, and for every person in that room who had stood in a version of the same parking lot and had nobody coming for them at all. He nodded to the room once. Then he went and found Barry Wicks at the line and got to work. Power does not reveal a person. The moment of revelation is always smaller than that. It is a secondary entrance on a gray morning, a word spoken in front of 63 witnesses, a silence that a room decides is cheaper than speaking. It is a young security officer who says something quiet to a woman at an inspection table because he cannot think of anything else to do. It is the woman who makes the call. It is the man who stands in the parking lot and waits, because he is the first person in 14 years who can afford to let the thing happen, and he knows it, and he does not waste the morning.